Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the third chapter in the first book of Kings. We took it all the way up until the first 15 verses. We're going to do it from 16 all the way home through 28, and we're going to review Solomon is secure on his throne. It was not without struggle. It was not without blood. He had to contend against a rival claimant, Adoniah, the eldest living son of David, who was the younger brother of Absalom, who himself tried to usurp the throne from his father David. And because of the infancy of the institution of the monarchy, there had really only been Saul and David thus far, so there had been no passing of any kingdom from one father to a son yet, and the practice was generally because he was a polygamous marriage, Bathsheba being his favorite wife, Solomon being her son, would have been his designated chair. But he had not made this exactly clear, and Adoniah takes it upon himself because he's the oldest one. He's about 35 years old. Solomon is 19. And then at the attention of Nathan, the prophet comes in once more, and Bathsheba draws attention to the fact that Adoniah, and the reason that Adoniah was getting away with this is because David was lax in disciplining his own son. He is old and infirm, but then he forcefully intervenes in Solomon's favor, and then his parting words suggest that he purge and liquidate Joab, his principal general who had served him so well, yet he was not entirely innocent. He had slain two men, and he had killed his son Absalom, or allowed it to happen when he was told not to. So David seeks his revenge on people who had wronged him, one of whom he had sworn in his days he would not seek revenge, but he says he is not the one who had cursed him when he was fleeing from Absalom. And then he ends up killing his brother Adoniah and those who joined him in his rebellion. His brother Adoniah, and in the first four verses, we meet David, who is old and infirm and tended to and nursed by a young virgin, who Adoniah requests his hands in marriage through his mother Bathsheba, who draws it to Solomon's son, and then Solomon eventually kills. And I think Joab seeks refuge on the horns of the altar, as was the custom and the practice for those who were guilty of manslaughter, but he is slain there, and the man who slays him, Solomon exalts to the leader of the military. He was a more militarily mediocre man than Joab, but it was to Solomon's advantage to have someone he couldn't, not the nuisance that his father David did, because his reign was to be one of peace. And then in the third chapter, we read that he is married to the daughter of Pharaoh, Egypt. This would have been the final king of the 21st dynasty. By the transition in Egypt, the 22nd dynasty occurs during the lifetime of Solomon, and they actually offer sanctuary to one of Solomon's Edomite enemies, and also Jeroboam, the attempted rebel who actually divides the kingdom, becomes the first king of the northern kingdom of Israel. He seeks sanctuary and refuge, so Egypt is no longer a friend by the end of Solomon's reign, but in the beginning they were an important ally, and he did he had a lucrative position as a middleman for Egyptian horses. The top horses in the world came through Egypt, and he profited lucratively from his geographical position in that. And this is the most biographically significant moment of his life. This is before there was a temple to be built. They were at Gibeon. That was the place of the tabernacle. So before there was a temple, the center and sanctuary was a tabernacle. It had an intricate design, but the dimensions of the temple were about twice as large as we compare and contrast the dimensions of which we read of in Kings. But then at Gibeon, verse 5, at Gibeon, Yahweh appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and Elohim said, ask what I shall give you. So what's interesting here is this is in response to obedience. Solomon is sacrificing about 1,000. This is a massive, significant slaughtering and sacrifice. So he was attending to the religious duties as the king, and it was there that night. Dreams is one of the forms of revelation in the Old Testament. He spoke to the patriarchs and also the enemies of Israel, or the antagonists, those outside Israel, through dreams. Joseph had the ability, not only had dreams, but the ability to interpret them. Jacob had dreams. Abraham had dreams, and Daniel had dreams and the ability to interpret them. So dreams is a legitimate revelatory communication. Now, the word appeared has visual connotations with specifically luminous entailments, but we are not privy to any visible description of the theophanic manifestation. What we are told are the words that are spoken, and he's giving him a blank check, anything he wants, and the heart's desire is a test and revelation of one's character. If you could ask for anything in the world, what would you, and you were guaranteed to be given it, that would be a test of your character. And Solomon acknowledges the kindness that he has shown his father, and just that his place on the throne is an act of grace, and that he owes his position to him. And but he is young and inexperienced. He is aware of the monumentality of the task. He has a sense of the awesomeness of the people that he is to lead and the God he is to serve, and a consequent and intended sense of his own insignificance and inadequacy. So then he says this in verse 9, "Shall you then give to your servant an understanding heart to rule your people, to discern between good and evil? For who is able to rule this great people of yours?" It would be an oversimplification to suggest that Solomon had no wisdom to begin with prior to asking for the bestowal of the wisdom, which he receives in unprecedented and unduplicated amounts. Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived, and it was because of this dream, because he had asked for it. This is what he desired most. He took his responsibility seriously. He was mature beyond his years. He was 19 years old. When I was 19 years old, I was more worried about partying than ruling. I, of course, didn't have a kingdom to inherit, but he was wise to ask for the wisdom, because wisdom is needed. Wisdom is needed in power. So Solomon was the personification of the Platonic ideal of a philosopher king 400 years before it was even an idea, and he was the actualization of the idea. And the word was good in the eyes of Yahweh that Solomon had asked this. His request is both accepted and approved and authorized. So he likes what he hears, and he not only is impressed by what he asked for, but he is equally impressed with what he does not ask for. The long life, riches, the life of your enemies. So he says this in verse 12, "See, I shall do according to your word. See, I shall give you a wise and understanding heart, so that there was none like you before you, and none like you shall rise after you." The prayer for wisdom is consistent and commensurate with the will of the Father. James 1, 5 and 6. All we need to do is ask in faith, not doubt, and we can receive the endowment of wisdom that we need. Now, our task is not as monumental as his, so we will not be gifted in equal proportion to the wisdom that Solomon. This is a unique depository and an endowment of wisdom. There's never been anything like it before, and never been anything like it since. And this wisdom is foundational to what we read of Solomon, who is the human protagonist of the first 11 chapters in the first book of Kings. "And I shall give you what you have not asked for, both riches and esteem, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days." So he didn't ask for wealth, but he received it, and he was able to accumulate as much wealth he did because of the endowment of wisdom. The intricacies of his trading with Hiram and just the amount of gold that was brought in are all explained and detailed in the subsequent book. But once more, the extent that he receives it is unprecedented and unduplicated, unlike anyone before and anyone since. And then verse 14, there's a reminder that as a king, as much as the commoner, he is bound by covenantal obedience. "And if you walk in my ways and guard my laws and my commandments as your father David walked, then I shall prolong your days." In verse 3, we read that, "And Solomon loved Yahweh, walking in the laws of his father in David." So for the greater part of his life, he did prolong his life. He was an obedient king. He was a righteous king. He was responsible to the law. But as he gets old, abruptly and almost inexplicably, we read in the 11th chapter that Solomon is ultimately a tragic figure because of his fall from grace. He had been the recipient of divine grace to a unique extent, but he is ultimately a tragic figure because he succumbed to idolatry. He loved his numerous wives. Here we only read of Pharaoh, but he had about 700 wives by the 11th chapter, and he loved them, and they deviated his heart from the covenantal laws. But before that, everything we read is just a manifestation of the wisdom which he receives in answer to a prayer in a dream, he awakes and sees that it is a dream. Nevertheless, the dream is real, because we're about to see an application of the wisdom in the judgment that he administers. As a king, one of his duties would have been to hear court cases and issue verdicts and rulings, and he does that here. And it also goes into the organizational apparatus of his kingdom, and the extent of his encyclopedic knowledge is also indicated in the 4th chapter. And the 5th, we read of the wisdom of his commercial alliance and commercial arrangement with Hiram. And then 6 through 8 is the temple. And then the 9 is just all the cities and all the wealth. And the 10th, he impresses the Queen of Sheba. Then in the 11th, that's when he falls from grace. But before that, the original application of his wisdom begins in the 16th verse, lesson itself. Then 2 women, whores, came to the king and stood before him. Prostitution was illegal, and it is certainly frowned upon, and as king he couldn't have endorsed it, but he received them not as prostitutes, but as people. Prostitutes are people, and in the New Testament, the unlikeliest of characters respond to the message that saved. They grasp the good news. The prostitutes and the publicans, the least likely characters, make the most of it. So it is important that we view all people as people and not by their professions, no matter what it is. And everyone in a just society is entitled to a judgment and due process. No one should be, so their particular situation of which we read demands a hearing, and they were able to appeal to the king through the system. And one woman said, "Oh, my master, this woman and I dwell in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house." That house would have been a brothel. This would have been the common residential location where prostitutes lived in close proximity. They shared quarters, and they would have lived together in brothels where they would have exchanged their sex for money and beds in the brothel. So that is the house there. And while in there, they give birth. This would have been a common thing. There was no birth control. There was no contraception. So birth would have been part of the job as a prostitute. It really only takes once. Normally or ordinarily, if you want to get a woman pregnant, you have to have sex with her repeatedly. But at the same time, all it does is take once. So this could happen to prostitutes. We don't know if the baby was born, probably not marriage, but the baby was born out of fornication. Nevertheless, that baby belongs to its rightful mother, self-evidently so. And it came to be in the 3rd day after I had given birth that this woman also gave birth, and we were together. There was no one else with us in the house, only the 2 of us in the house. So the timeline is 3 days after she gives birth. The other mother experiences the same blessing, but ultimately squanders them. But she is able to get away with her treachery because they are alone together. So in this brothel, there is only them. And what happens is through her own carelessness, she kills her own son by laying on it. Babies are fragile, so this mother is not a model mother. A mother has to know these things, and a mother would know how to answer Solomon when he asked the question which determines the verdict. Then this woman's son died in the night because she laid on him. Not a responsible mother to be the cause of your own child's death through laying on him and not have a crib for him where he can lay unprotected from a giant human being who is physically capable of crushing such a small infant by laying on it. So the mother exists to protect and nurse her son. This mother ended up killing her son through her own criminal indifference and neglect. So she had no one to blame but herself, but being a mother, and she is, in addition to careless, she is also treacherous. She conspires to steal that woman's baby, and she's able to, or she tries to get away with it only because no one else is watching. So what we do when no one else is watching is the definition of integrity. And she rose up in the middle of the night and took my son from my side while your female servant slept, and laid him in her bosom, and laid her dead child in my bosom. She did a switcheroo. She took her dead son and took the live one, claimed her as her own, acted like it was hers, nursed it, had it on her bosom, probably breastfed it and everything. But she took advantage of her while she was sleeping. And of course, when she wakes up, a mother who has an actual maternal care for her child is know that she's not going to have killed her. Something like that could never have happened in her hands while she was sleeping. Something else is up. And this, she doesn't recognize, babies do look distinct from each other. They do have identities. They're not as pronounced as fully matured people, but they do have distinct physical characteristics. It's easy to tell which one is which. And I rose up in the morning to nurse my son, and saw he was dead. But I looked at him closely in the morning, and saw that he was not my son, whom I had borne. So she does what a mother does. The first thing, her first thought and first concern is for a child. This is a maternal instinct. She goes to nurse her son, and she notices it's not her son. This is not the one she had given birth to. This looks nothing like him. Not only that, but he is dead. So something is amiss. Something is up. And, I looked closely, so this wasn't my son. So I knew that my son was alive, and this was not him. And the other woman said, "No, but the living one is my son, and the dead one is your son." And the first woman said, "No, for the dead one is your son, and the living one is my son." And they spoke before the king. They both essentially said the same thing when you really break down the sentence and when you really think about it. The living one is my son, the dead one is your son, mine, yours, opposites, dead, living, opposites, so that all syncs up and adds up and makes sense. And they're speaking before the king, so this is their day in court, so this is their petition, this is what they say in the presence of the judge. And the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son who lives, and your son is the dead one,' while the other says, 'No, for your son is the dead one, and my son is the living one.'" He essentially repeats what we read in verse 22 or on verse 23, so he just reiterates the court case, and again they're saying the same thing. They're both claiming the child as their own and the dead one as belonging to the other rival claimant, the one who is trying to steal their actual live baby from them. They are the mother of the dead one. They both claim to be the mother of the living one. They claim the other one is the mother of the dead one. And the king said, "Bring me a sword." So they brought a sword before the king. The king meant business, but he was only acting. He brought the sword out in order to threaten to kill it, in order to reveal the response, because by that response he knew that the mother's reaction would not allow that to happen. So he knew what he was saying, he knew what he was doing. He was not prepared to kill the child. He was prepared to give the child to its rightful owner, its rightful mother. And the way he did that was by pretending to be prepared to kill it, to slice it in half, to settle the dispute by giving them half each. But a dead baby is no baby at all. And the king said, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other." It would be a solution if children could still live and breathe, if you could slice them in half and they could still function, but that's just not the case. They're living beings. You can't do that with a frog or any other life form. When you bring a sword to any living being, that terminates their life. But it does sound good, a good enough settlement to the phony mother, the one who stole the child. And the woman whose son was living spoke to the king, for she was overcome with compassion for her son. And she said, "O my master, give her to the living child, and by no means kill him." But the other said, "Let him be neither mine nor yours, but divide him." The same underlying motive that Yahshua did to perform many of his miracles, that emotion of compassion, it is alive and it is embedded in mothers, and she is overcome, she is overwhelmed, she is exuding compassion abundantly for her child, for her son, so that is her motive. And she would rather see him alive and given to a mother who is not her than to have him dead just to spite this woman. The child's life is paramount, and if she would like to have that child in her care for herself as her own, but she is not. She would rather she would rather it live than not live with her, or per se. But the other one, there's no emotion indicated, there's no motivation or underlying thought indicated. She just casually says, she doesn't even think about what is saying. She says, "Sounds good enough to me." She does not even examine the verdict on its merits. No investigative integrity. So it'll be neither mine nor yours. It's essentially meaningless to me if I would allow the king to do this, what he is asking to do. And the king answered and said, "Give the first woman the living child, and by no means kill him. She is his mother." So the first woman was the one who was right, the one who was self-evidently the mother, the one who had given the most convincing story and given the correct response in issue to the verdict. The verdict was not the actual verdict, it was the pre-verdict. The verdict is now given that don't kill him at all. The sword is just for show. Give him to the mother. She is her identity as the child's mother is self-evident and irrefutable at this point. How could it not be when this other woman would let him go through with the sword? He's not going to do that. He's going to give it to the mother who wouldn't let that happen because that is the obvious mother. And all Israel heard of the judgment which the king had rendered, and they revered the king, for they saw that the wisdom of Elohim was in him to do justice. So the reputation spread far and wide. Now the exploits of Solomon's wisdom are depicted topically, not chronologically. So we don't know when this happened, but in all likelihood it happened pretty early in his reign. So this was perhaps one of the early applications of the unique endowment of wisdom. And he asked, one of the things he wanted to do was to discern between good and evil and to judge and rule. To rule and to judge would have been two of the things. And it takes justice issuing ultimatums, deciding people's fate, and determining criminality or lack thereof does demand wisdom. It cannot be done. It should not be done apart from wisdom. But the reputation for solid wisdom now. The reputation for wisdom today, for justice today is of injustice and corruption. But they had a king who cared, and a king who ruled, and a king who was wise, and a king who was just, and they knew it. And this exploit, they knew that God was with him, and the king was with God, and blessings would shower upon their kingdom. A golden age was literally upon them. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.